The final chapter of Fair Chase in North America wasn't written by me, and in fact, wasn't my idea to put it in the book. But it was a great idea, and I truly wish I'd thought of it because, in many ways, this was one of the stories that started it all. It was written by my uncle, Art Popham, and it's about a hunt that he made into the desert mountains of Sonora in August of 1934 in the company of his English professor, a fellow named Jack O'Connor. And they remained lifelong friends. They hunted together a few more times over the years, quite a few more times. And Jack was actually godfather to one of my cousins. Now, that isn't to say I knew him because I really didn't, but I certainly grew up in his shadow with him as a family friend from a great distance. And of course, I admired his writing and wanted to be just like him. And it was Art who sponsored me as a professional member of Boone and Crockett clear back in 1981, a long, long time ago now. And so I've always admired him. He was one of the early sheep hunters. He completed his 4 North American wild sheep in the early 1960s and hunted Africa and hunted Iran and did a lot of wonderful things in a very long life that I always swore that I'd be able to do. And the truth is I've been able to do most of them, but I certainly wasn't able to hunt in Sonora with Jack O'Connor. Chapter 18, Ram from Inferno by Arthur C. Popham, Jr. High-flying fish in the desert was only one of the many incidents of this weird trip into a fiery furnace. I was enjoying a cool vacation from college, surrounded by Minnesota's 10,000 limpid lakes, when Jack O'Connor's telegram came from Tucson, Arizona. He was inviting me to join him on a desert sheep hunt arranged with Charlie Wren, then the aging dean of the desert hunters. Before September classes started at the University of Arizona was our only chance for a crack at those rare trophies. Then Jack's duties in teaching journalism and mine and learning law resumed. So I headed eagerly for Tucson to meet him, little realizing how soon I'd be gasping for just one cupful of all that clear, cool water I left behind. This was too many years ago, before the desert bighorns in Mexico's arid mountains were so nearly wiped out by waterhole slaughters, and before their hunting was totally prohibited there. The renaissance, meanwhile, of the Rocky Mountain to desert bighorn sheep is another fine chapter in the saving of our North American game animals. Good management of the wild herds in the western states has made possible again their limited open seasons, and Mexico has recently permitted the taking of some desert sheep in the Baja California area after long protection. Harvesting the older animals under these allotted permits has now become a well-organized operation in some areas for private outfitters and guides, pitting aerial spotting, four-wheel drive vehicles, and walkie-talkie communication between spotters against the sheep's telescopic eyesight, protective coloring, and fearless agility in its rough habitat. This has all brought to mind the very different kind of hunt for desert bighorns that we made. It had actually been Jack's fascinating articles in the early 1930s on southwestern hunting that had drawn me to the University of Arizona as a student, when he was then a young faculty member. I'd lost little time after enrolling and getting acquainted with him. We hunted Kaibab forest mule deer together on that Thanksgiving vacation and shot together for desert game through the year. Jack has gone on, of course, to become one of the outstanding authorities on the world's big game hunting and guns, and I've long enjoyed the extracurricular education I received with him then. So, in response to his telegram, I met Jack in Tucson that August, and we rode through the shimmering mirages to Ajo, Arizona. There, Charlie Wren, a lean old desert hawk, met us and assembled our gear and party in a vintage Dodge pickup truck and Ford sedan. We cleared at the border, then headed south toward the ranges paralleling the Gulf of California. Our group was filled out by Roy Graham, deputy sheriff at Ajo. Charlie's right-hand man was Jose del Rosario, a young red-headed Mexican who was to be my guide. I don't know if Red's coloring reflected Mayan or Irish influence, but he knew the desert, had marvelous eyesight, and was a keen hunter. After a day's travel, we ran out of ruts to follow and picked our way over the desert around the cactus. Cholla thorns, always lying in wait for tires, produce slow leaks that are aggravatingly persistent. The vehicles took a beating as we pushed our way in the scorching glare, scraping through the greasewood and spiny ocotillo, past stately saguaro and Oregon cactus, churning through dry washes. Sangre grotto trees with elephant-colored bark looked heavy and strong, but were easily snapped. Filled with staining red juice, they went down before the bumper like neck-shot deer. The boiling radiators took more and more of our precious water supply. Charlie planned to refill the 5-gallon cans at a water seep he knew that lay near the surface. This was used by the Seri Indians occasionally, and Charlie found the spot all right. But there we received our first body blow. The shallow wells were bone dry. The situation was saved by a rip-snorting thunderstorm that reached us after midnight. In the glare of the lightning, we saw the desert hardpan quickly become a lake as the rain lashed down in the crashing thunder. We finished the night in the car, sandwiched between the top and our hastily dumped-in gear. Our course next morning lay across a big arroyo. Dusty the night before, it was now brimful with a roaring torrent not far from a flash flood. So we boiled a big pot of Mexican frijoles and waited for the river to subside. Seri Indians had camped there ahead of us, and the shells of many roasted tortoises lay about. The runoff from the hard ground was so rapid that by late afternoon it was down to a shallow flow, and we were able to get the vehicles across. Meanwhile, we had gratefully filled the water cans with the precious muddy fluid that was both our salvation and delay. Pushing on southward, we reached a broad basin where the rain had formed a shallow lake several hundred yards across. There was a range of mountains within reach to hunt, so we unloaded where we had water and set out to look for sheep sign. Bouncing over the desert in the steaming laden cars had been hot, but climbing all day on the barren, scorching rocks with no shade to be found, even for brief respite, proved far more punishing. We found that our body's built-in evaporative cooling systems worked amazingly well as long as the water intake was ample. With the great exertion of climbing, a man had to consume at least a gallon a day to keep going. Even at that rate and more, it was all lost by perspiration, so that we needed no urinary systems. And what were we pumping through our pores at such a rate? It was the fluid from our big mud puddle at camp, and it was just the color of coffee with lots of cream. I'd squeeze a little lime juice in a cupful, which seemed to help settle the mud into the lower half, and sip off the top part. We must have had beautiful insides with all that mud pack treatment. While we lay in the cooling nights, Charlie Wren told us much of his desert sheep hunting lore. He pointed out that sound and scent travel upward from the canyons as well as in the rising air along the heated mountainsides, and he emphasized the advantage of getting above the sheep to hunt them. But, tied to our water supply, we couldn't get our camp closer than about 3 miles from the base of the mountain. This meant 6 miles of worthless walking over the desert in the heat every day. With the scant cover, of course, any sheep on our side of the mountain would see us coming from afar. They'd be long gone over to the other side before we even started the climb of 3,000 or 4,000 feet. This meant their only chance lay first in getting far up on our side of the mountain, higher than any sheep that might be on the other side. Then we could ease around the top and try to spot them from above. With the warm nights, the simple strategy would have been to lie out overnight on the mountain to be above any moving sheep at daylight, but we couldn't carry enough water to be away from the source that long and make it back to camp. So for 3 days we camped by our dwindling rain pool, walked to the mountain, clambered over the hot rocks, and found only some old sheep droppings. I did see one ewe after I'd spent half a day working up from the valley floor. I lay panting in the sparse shade of a cactus and watched her pick her way easily up the same mountainside, covering the distance in about 10 minutes. That's when you wonder what the heck a mere human animal is doing out on a mountain trying to make like a wild sheep. By then our big mud puddle had shrunk to almost a dried flat. As it receded, an object in the middle became identifiable as a long dead horse. No doubt his essence had added considerable strength to that steaming earthy broth, but we hastily decided to move. We were less than a day's travel from the Gulf of California shore. With so little encouragement in these first mountains, our lust for rams had become a little desiccated, along with everything else. The idea of feeling a cooling breeze from the water was more than we could stand, so we headed for the coast. Finally coming over a ridge and rolling over the parched land toward a broad beach, nothing ever looked better than that blue water reaching to the horizon. Yes, it was salty. We couldn't drink it. But compared to the cracking mud flat we'd left, just the sight of the clear, translucent water lapping at our feet was enough to bring a tear to the eye. We lost little time in plunging into the wet coolness to soak our dried-out hides. Small fish, flashing in the sun, darted about us. Then, as I waded along chasing them, something brushed between my legs. Glancing down, I was startled to see it was a stingray. Mindful of the reputed paralyzing pain of its tail stinger, I lost equally little time in seeking shallower water. Lack of meat had become a serious problem to us. We could carry no fresh meat, of course, without refrigeration, and in our heavy exertion in climbing felt the need of it badly. Efforts to bag an incidental deer as planned hadn't worked out. Now we watched the big, plump-breasted curlews feed in shifting flocks along the beach. There was a dinner worth trying for. We roamed up and down the shore with the shotgun, but had no cover of any kind. The only stalking possible was a pretended indifference. The birds must have seen the hungry gleam in our eyes, for those tantalizing tidbits would never let us within range. We saw fish of every kind rolling and jumping just offshore, such tempting seafare. Without boat or tackle, we could only watch them wistfully and drool. In the midst of this frustration, I'd noticed a great osprey with its nest in a tall saguaro cactus a quarter-mile inland. It had a regular route high over the blazing desert to the shore. There the powerful hawk would poise over the water, then plummet in out of sight to rise with a shining fish in its talons. Carrying its prey head first, like a pontoon slung below it, the bird would take the meal to the nest and soon return for another. In desperation, I stationed myself below the osprey's flight path and waited. Sure enough, over it came with a gleaming fish. I peppered the high-flying bird with shot, and the osprey flared, dropping the shiny prey. Running to the spot, I exultantly scooped up a fresh 15-inch mullet from the burning desert sand. Roasted brown, my Finney shotgun trophy made a grand dinner I'll never forget. That must be a record of some sort for shooting down the highest flying fish. Our beach was opposite Tiburon Island, about 3 miles out in the Gulf of California. It was the last stronghold of the Seri Indians. They're recognized as probably the most primitive people remaining on our continent, living under great privation. I've heard many stories of their indelicate taste as they scavenged the beaches for food, as well as their feats of running down mule deer on the rocky desert island they called home. They had camped about our location, as evidenced by more of their roasted tortoise shells, but none appeared while we were there. Though we'd brought bright trade goods to establish friendly relations with any we met, we were as happy not to have any of their uninhibited members around. We'd looked forward to a cool, pleasant night on the shore after the sun's torch died, envisioning a sea-fresh breeze to lull us by the lapping waves. Our sweet dream turned into a nightmare that left us all stupefied by morning. First, I was bitten by a blister bug. A red-hot needle hit me in the chest, and the spot spread to a fiery splotch the size of a dinner plate, with an incandescent blister in the middle. Believe me, those insects are potent. Then the breeze died completely. The moist sea air mingled with the desert's radiant heat, and a stifling blanket of humidity settled upon us. The discomfort was increased by our body's briny coating from the swimming, there being none of our precious fresh water for rinsing. And then the sand fleas took over. There was a night straight from purgatory. By dawn, we were all in such murderous humor that we almost feared speaking to each other. With common consent, we dully loaded up the cars and headed inland for a red mountain seen on the shoreward track. Charlie had found sheep there before, and our spirits rose as we rode. After our experience on the shore, we could appreciate better the dryness of the desert air and how its evaporative cooling made the heat bearable. With camp set up at the base of the long, typical upslope to the foot of the Red Mountains, we got down to business next morning. An early start was always a necessity. The dawn hours before the sun hit were precious for the long walk up the sloping foothills, or bajada, to the mountain's steep base. These were the memorably delightful times of the trip. The desert cools off rapidly at night. By dawn, we were chilly in shirt sleeves before swinging along over the dewy sand. There was often the fresh track of a ghostly mule deer to follow hopefully toward the high ground, but in the washes and gullies running from the slopes, not one ever offered a shot. Usually, after starting up the mountain, we could pick them up far below us with the glasses, standing silvery gray in the shade of a bent-armed saguaro. The long pleated arms of some of the pitaya cactus bore a coral-colored plum-sized fruit. These were scarce and always grew on the west side of the trunks, so even after the sun was well up, the fruits would be shaded. It was sheer delight to find one fresh and cool in the growing heat, break open its waxy watermelon red interior flecked with tiny black seeds, and savor the lush ambrosia. In proper season, I love the desert dearly, with all its unsuspected life, activity, and color. Many years after this trip of ours, I had the privilege of working much with the late Grancel Fitz, dedicated North American big game hunter and co-author of the scoring system, judging for the Boone and Crockett Records Committee the continent's top trophies. I was most intrigued to learn that he, too, had made a desert sheep hunt with outfitter Charlie Wren, but more sensibly, in November of that same year. As Gransell noted in the fine story he wrote of his trip, it was the last year of legal hunting for the species in Mexico and until the recent limited reopening some 30 years later. The perils and hardships of our trip came mostly from poor timing, for which we had no choice before classes began. These mountains were mostly composed of crumbling volcanic rock, dangerous to rely on when climbing. Great chunks would come off in our hands where we sought a purchase. One day Jack and I stood on a rocky mountainside perch, curiously noting a 3-foot wide white strip of limestone, a monolith embedded in the once liquid lava that dropped steeply some 30 feet to a lower level. Centuries of drainage had worn a polished trough down its length, and the red rock around it had crumbled away, leaving a perfect elevated 45-degree angled chute. Not realizing how slick it was, I was nonchalantly standing at its head. Suddenly my feet shot forward, and down the chute I started, scope-sighted rifle slung on one shoulder, canteen flying on the other. Somehow I managed to keep my feet, no doubt from the Minnesota aquaplaning recently left, and landed intact at the bottom. When we incredibly saw that no casualty had come from such a potential disaster, in our relief Jack and I laughed till we were weak. He gasped that all I'd needed was a stem Christie at the bottom with the rifle as a pole to make it a perfect ski run. One evening, I thought I'd come in with a real prize, a canteen full of crystal clear water. Parched on the mountainside late that day, I'd run onto a deep, dark, vertical crevice with green moss, of all things, protruding from the bottom. Peering curiously into its cool, dim depth, I saw a pool of clear water in the bottom. It was the first of anything but liquefied mud that I'd seen to drink for days, and I joyfully slipped my canteen through the 6-inch wide crack to plunge it in to fill. Withdrawing it, I drank copiously, then refilled the canteen in the dark pool to take to camp. I could hardly wait to share my treat till I walked in and hurried to pour a white enamel cupful as we all drooled. That was the first of the liquid I'd seen in clear light, and on beholding it illuminated in the white cup, I groaned. Barely visible, thousands of nearly microscopic organisms danced in the water. As Charlie shook his head, I thought of all that I'd drunk from the canteen and weakly poured out my very dubious prize. Maybe that had something to do with the serious illness, surgery, and weeks of hospitalization spent after I got back to Tucson and missed a year of law school. Although there'd been some encouraging fresh sheep sign in these red mountains, we were finally down to our last day, and still I'd seen no ram. The heat, bad water, and climbing had exhausted us till we had little spirit left, but I knew that I'd hate myself forever if I didn't make that last try. So, after some packing up, Red and I set out late in the morning for a final day on the mountain. He set a rugged pace, for we had to get over the summit in time to watch the far side. I had to plead for mercy from time to time. One of our worst enemies was the great swarm of tiny gnats that continually engulfed us. We moved, ate, drank, and breathed in an atmosphere composed one half of gnats. They bothered me most when I was climbing, soaked with perspiration, my hands too occupied to brush them off. Then they got into my ears so badly that I had finally, in desperation, made earmuffs of cloth with drawstrings around the outside. Despite their incongruity in the desert heat, they helped. Nearly crazed with the droning swarm all over me, I crept up the burning rocks after Rosario, that red-haired will-o'-the-wisp, deliriously panting dreadful imprecations upon all the insect life of Mexico. Reaching the top, we found a breeze that cleared the swarm, and I regained some breath and composure. There, the scope of the panorama about us was fascinating. From miles away, we could see occasional fluffy cumulus clouds building as they floated over the tawny desert. Then the dark, slanting columns of rain would march along under them, usually evaporating short of the scorching earth. Red and I worked around the peak then, onto a ridge that ran above a big canyon. We soon picked up some very fresh sheep tracks running along a bench toward the canyon bottom. Some were made by good-sized rams, and our excitement mounted rapidly. We'd followed them but a few yards when Red clutched my arm and whispered hoarsely, "Mira, Mira, look." He was pointing across the canyon. Following his arm, I saw a line of 6 rams moving to our right along the opposite canyon wall. They were heading for a notch in the rim close ahead of them. Quickly, I slipped my arm through the rifle sling and dropped prone. The range looked to be about 275 yards, but as I settled down to pick them up in the 4-power Noski scope, the sheep took alarm. They started running, raced through the cleft, and disappeared. Just as I started to scramble to my sheep in chagrin, a magnificent ram, evidently the leader, ran up onto a skyline crag across the canyon. There on that rocky turret he poised, quartering towards us, curling horns lifted high, as he searched for the danger. This was such an absolute storyback climax to end the hunt that I'm really embarrassed to tell it, but that's just the way it happens, so help me. It was the picture and the shot of which every hunter dreams. Now 50 years and many sheep later, I can still see that poised ram in the hot sunlight. How many dry practice shots had I snapped before the trip at a miniature target of just such a ram? Automatically then, the crosshairs settled on the top of his shoulder, the finger squeezed. At the rifle's crash, the ram collapsed and pitched off the cliff dead, struck down by a 150-grain thunderbolt. Red and I joyfully shouted and embraced, then hurriedly scaled down the canyon walls and up again to reach our trophy. After the sheep was skinned out, a fiendish trip in the afternoon heat lay ahead of us before we could get the trophy back to camp. We needed some of the meat badly, too, and cut a loin from the ram. It grieved us to be able to handle no more, but a 40-pound head and cape with the meat rifle and canteens was a grueling load in the deadly heat, and we had no way to keep the meat. The canyon seemed infinitely steeper as we started back. By the time we traversed its steep slopes again, worked back around the mountain and down its crumbling walls, we were both at the point of complete frustration. Our canteens were long dry, but throughout the day I had doggedly clung to a quart can of grapefruit juice. We reeled to the base of the mountain and collapsed under a sparse greasewood bush. Red seemed as done as I. It was a while before we could collect our senses enough to get the can of juice opened. The thought of its contents was about all that had sustained me going down the mountain. That warm, sticky fluid was the most Olympian nectar ever sipped by man, I know. It revived us enough for the final haul over the desert to camp. There, sheep meat and the elation of success eased our exhaustion. The trip back to Ajo was made without incident. Jack's hunt is a story of its own, but as we sped over the highway back to Tucson, we marveled at the physical toughening that climbing gives. Going past a small, rugged mountain a couple 1,000 feet high, Jack said, "I wish I had one of those in my backyard, just to run over before breakfast every morning." That article was originally published in Outdoor Life, and my first cousin still has not only the biggest sheep from that trip, but also Art's four North American wild rams that they keep in their den as kind of a tribute to her dad and my uncle. He was really one of the pioneers, but in those days, you didn't always tell things the way they happened, and I guess we still don't today. It was years and years later. And Art wasn't around to explain what really happened, but I happened upon a photograph from that trip, and there's Art and there's old Charlie Wren, and they're holding the ram, except there's something a little bit wrong with that photo. There's more than one ram. Art's the only one that got one on that trip as far as is known. Jack certainly didn't, but O'Connor went back later that year and took his own first ram, but apparently when they got into those rams, there was a bit of a shooting gallery, and they actually had more than one without knowing it, which in those days was not the problem that such a thing would be today. But also, it's fair to say that in those days, they didn't have the optics that we have today. So it was a different hunt in a different time in a different world, and I'm really proud that my friends at Boone and Crockett thought to include it in this book.
When you go on an outfitted hunt, you're betting more than just your hard-earned cash. You're betting your vacation time, your safety, and your hunting dreams. You've got to get it right. There's a lot of ways to find a good outfitter, but a simple way is to go on my website, CraigBoddington.com, and take a look at our Craig Boddington Endorsed Outfitter program. Go on the website and you hook up directly with the outfitter. It's based on 40 years of hunting experience worldwide. My program's a group of outfitters that I believe in, and they believe in me. Hey, I know a good outfitter.